Well, welcome to the Cinnabar. Now today we've got an issue with a scarce Colt Burgess lever action rifle that we've got apart here on our bench. This thing has rather massive headspace. And when I say massive, I'm talking about over 60 thousandths gap with the action close between the back of the cartridge and the bolt face. Okay, so that's a lot. Now, people tend to get all worked up about excess headspace. And the reality is, in these older guns from this era, I'd say the majority of them that we work on have at least some excess headspace, and really doesn't cause an issue in these kind of rifles and these kind of calibers. You know, the modern bolt guns that we're pushing up high chamber pressures and trying to get extreme accuracy out to 1,000 yards, yeah, getting the headspace just right is crucial. And these older guns that were basically just shooting paper, they're not creating a whole bunch of chamber pressure. The worst thing that really happens if there's a few thousandths extra headspace is they back the primer out a little bit. It really doesn't hurt anything, and you really can't even tell much in the way of difference in accuracy if we take up the headspace. Now, some of them are really easy to take up the headspace, and when we have a choice, we always want to push the bolt forward. Now, we've got this extra gap between the bolt and the barrel. We've got, you know, two options for closing up that headspace. We either move the bolt forward or the barrel back. And so moving the bolt forward with a lot like the Winchesters that have locking blocks in them, or the Marlins, a lot of them have some form of locking block, and we can try to find a little wider locking block, or in the case of like 1894s, they sell a locking block with a little extra thickness to push that bolt forward. There are some designs though that don't lend themselves well, and this is one of them. This Colt Burgess, it has this one big thick short toggle link that fits into a tiny little space inside the bolt, and there's very little room. If we try to extend that out so that it's going to push that bolt forward, it causes all sorts of problems, and it basically locks up the bolt and locks up the action. So we don't really have a choice now. We've got to move this barrel back to take up the headspace. So today we're going to get set up here, and I'll show you kind of a close-up of what we're dealing with, and then we're going to take this barrel over to the lathe, and we're going to turn this shoulder back so that we can screw that barrel in one more turn. Okay, so these Colt Burgess rifles are kind of prone to having headspace issues if they've been used much. We can get some wear in the pins on this big single toggle link here. This one is really actually pretty tight. The pin that this toggle link rotates on, and then the other pin here is where the bolt is pinned to that toggle link. Here's an interesting one. This is the firing pin out of a Colt Burgess. It has to run over the top of that toggle link, so it sits inside the bolt like this over the top of it. You can see there's some clearance issues in there. If we're going to try to do anything to change that geometry, there's not much room for it. Where a lot of the headspace comes from on these Burgess rifles is that we get wear if they weren't lubricated up really good all the time. You can see this bolt is just sloppy loose in the receiver itself. I can push from the bottom, and you know, there's all sorts of up and down movement, and whenever that bolt is pushed up against there and we've got all that wear, that's creating headspace. But this one has an additional issue that most don't have, in that whoever was running the machine that was cutting the chambers that day for Colt, they fell asleep on this one, because we put that cartridge in here, and there's 22 thousandths difference from the back of that rim to the edge of that barrel. So you can probably see just how deep that chamber was cut. The back of that cartridge should be flush with the barrel, and we can see that it's recessed down in there a long way. So we're going to have to cut the breech end of this barrel off to get it to where it's flush. Now, I used a Starline brass for this kind of work. Most 4440 today is loaded with Starline brass. Starline brass is a lot more consistent. One of the frustrating parts of dealing with Headspace is that a lot of manufacturers have a different thickness of rim, and these Headspace off the rim thickness. So it's supposed to be about 65 thousandths. I find that these Starline are probably the most consistent at about 65 thousandths. Get that out of there. Okay, so we're going to cut approximately 22,000 off the breech end back here. And then in order to set this barrel back one turn, there are 20 threads per inch. And so each of those threads is about 50 thousandths. It is exactly 50 thousandths actually. So we're going to have to cut this shoulder back 50 thousandths so that we can do one exact turn of this barrel. And we can't just turn one flat because obviously our sight dovetails are cut in on one flat there, so it has to go all the way around a complete 360 degrees to get back up there. Now, what we don't have to do, fortunately, is to cut another thread. And you can see there's a little unthreaded portion between the shoulder and the start of the threads there. And it's fairly narrow. And on the receiver side, if we get the receiver up here where you can kind of see it, you can see that there's quite a deep area there before the threads start. So if we cut that shoulder back, it's going to make an unthreaded area a little deeper, but it won't be deep enough that we'll have to cut that extra thread in there, which helps a lot. It's not particularly hard to pick up a thread and cut one if we needed to, and we would if we had to turn this barrel in 2 turns, then we would have to cut that thread back a little further. Okay, we've got this barrel indicated in. We've indicated in off the threads because that's what we're working off of. If this were a barrel that we were doing the chamber and threading on from scratch, we would certainly indicate off the center line of the bore. And this one, the center line of the bore and the threading was really close. Now we've got a cartridge here. We've popped the primer out of it so we don't get a false reading off of the primer. And we've got the correct tool for the job now, a depth gauge or depth indicator. And we're seeing about 20 to 21 thousandths. So I'm going to cut the back of that rim off at 20 thousandths. And just to kind of show you how deep that chamber was cut, here's a lathe bit here. We're using a straight edge. And see how far that can move back and forth. That shouldn't be like that. Of course, that rim cut should make that rim flush right with the back of the barrel, that breech end. Okay, so we've got zeroed in on that breech end of the barrel. Now it's just a matter, we're going to cut a 10 thousandths cut. We'll remeasure just to double check, and then we'll go the rest of the way. Dig that cartridge out of there, or that brass I should say. And now we'll take another 10 thousandths cut and we'll be done with this. Here's our piece of brass here. And there we are. We're within a thou. Actually, right on the money right there in that measurement. About a half a thou there. Yeah, that's way closer than what we need to be, within a half a thou to a thou. Now it's time to, let's get that shoulder cut back now. All right, now we've touched off on everything. We know where our zeros are. We know we've got to roll that shoulder back 50 thousandths. So what I'm going to do is I'll cut 40 thousandths cut, and then we'll grab the receiver and thread it on. And if everything is looking correct, we should get about a quarter of a turn from indexing up and timing up properly. If that happens, then we'll take the rest of our cut, and then we should be good to go. Okay, we'll get that all cleaned up, and then we'll see how that receiver rolls on there. Alright, so this is our top flat here. There's a little witness mark on top of it, and of course we can see our extractor cut here on the top. So let's see if we can get this thing threaded in. And if everything is correct, it won't quite index up. It'll be about 75–80% of the last turn, and perfect. So see, we're running 90 degrees to where we want to be, so we've got a quarter turn to go. So we're going to take that last 10 thousandths off, and we should time it up just right. And we want it to not quite come up, or we want it to come up tight just before it indexes, because we want to tighten it down a little bit, get a good tight fit on that receiver to barrel. Okay, here we go, our last 10 thousandths. Alright, let's see how we did. Okay, now we're down to the moment of truth. If everything's just right, this thing will stop about maybe 5 degrees from timing up perfectly, and then we'll put her in the barrel vise and go the rest of the way. There it is. Maybe just slightly more than 5 degrees, but right there on the money. So we've got room here to tighten everything up, then we'll index everything in, time it up perfectly, and then we'll see how our headspace measurement comes out. We put everything back together. Alright, now the barrel and receiver timed up just beautifully, so we've got everything put back together now. And one word of caution, when you set a barrel back, of course we've set it back 50 thousandths, so we've got a magazine tube and a fore end now that are 50 thousandths too long, and they've got to be shortened up as well. In this case, we took about 50 thousandths off the breech end of the magazine tube, and there was some pretty good gaps in the fore end, so we only took up about 25 thousandths, shortened it up and closed them gaps up as well, so everything's good and tight now. Now you might be thinking that, well, if you do a barrel setback, then you've shortened the barrel up and it's no longer original, and you know, that's true, that it is a tiny little bit shorter now. But how do we measure barrels? I mean, I've always just used a tape measure. Now a Burgess rifle's 25.5 inches. We put a tape measure on it and we see 25.5 inches, because you really don't pick up that 50 thousandths there. Now if you had a 26-inch micrometer, maybe you'd find that, but just using a tape measure, usually we're looking for the number of inches or even fractions of an inch that a barrel's been shortened. In this case, it just flat doesn't show up. Now, the moment of truth on whether we've got the depth right on cutting the back end of this barrel off, the breech end. Now remember that we just cut that breech end off to where it made that back end of that cartridge flush with the breech end of the barrel. And from the get-go, it looked like the math would let us do that, and we would be right in the ballpark for the depth correct. So typically that's not how it's done. Typically it doesn't come out that close when we just set the barrel back, and usually we don't have to cut it off to make that rim cut the right depth. You know, typically we're going to cut it way back, and then we're going to cut that end of that barrel back up just to where the bolt will close on the back of the barrel, and then we're going to have to deepen the chamber. And we haven't touched the chamber on this one. So it'd be a little bit like winning the lottery twice if we just cut the back end of that barrel off and it was the right depth, and then we didn't have to do anything with the chamber. I mean, maybe 1 in a million would you set back 50 thousandths, cut 21 thousandths off the breech end to get the depth right, and it would all come out and we wouldn't touch the chamber. Typically we've always got to deepen the chamber some. So if we see we're closing up the lever here, and it just snaps into place. So that bolt face just touched the breech end of the barrel at just the right spot, so that we just came up tight right at the end of the stroke. And that's important with a Burgess, because almost all Burgess rifles and carbines have some lever slop. You see, there's nothing in here like on a Winchester toggle link action where they've got a lever cam and a spring that holds that lever up. If it's not tight, that lever just droops, unless you turn the lever latch on it, of course. So that's really good if it comes out that way. And I'd like to say it was just skillfully done, but you know, it just came out perfectly the right length when we cut that breech end to match the back end of the cartridge. So really a fortunate situation there. Okay, so now the moment of truth. We got to check out the Headspace, and so the first thing we want to do is use a Headspace gauge, and in this case a field gauge. Now there's a lot of misinformation out there about Headspace gauges. If you suspect Headspace, I see people all the time suggesting you go get no-go and go gauges. Go gauges and no-go gauges are for cutting new, fresh chambers. A field gauge is what we use to measure the headspace in a firearm that has seen field action. That's why it's a field gauge, and we can test it out in the field. It's just a couple thousandths longer typically than your no-go gauge, and that's the SAMI spec for rifles that have seen field use. We've got our field gauge here. We're going to put it in here, and if it closes on it, we've got a problem. See there? That lever is not up all the way. It's lacking about 3/4 of an inch coming up, so it will not close on a field gauge. So it's time to buy that lottery ticket. We did not touch the chamber on this. This is the original chamber cut, and we cut both the shoulder and the breech end off, and that chamber just happened to fall in there to where we don't close a field gauge on it. Okay, so the best go gauge there is the brass that you're going to use when you shoot the gun. Now the reason for that is that this brass and most of these old guns headspace off the rim, and there's a lot of variation in rim thicknesses when different manufacturers, and sometimes by the same manufacturer there's huge variations. Now in the case of 4440, we've found that typically factory Winchester ammunition has a very thin rim thickness, much thinner than say Remington. Remington is as much as 8 thousandths thicker than Winchester, and the Remington's closer to what it should be. Winchester's just really thin. Well, that just creates headspace. A lot of times, if you've got headspace, changing your ammunition to a brass that's made with a thicker rim will take up your headspace. In this case, as I mentioned before, we're using Starline brass because that's most of the 4440 now these days is made from Starline brass. So we've got a piece of Starline brass here, and we're going to use that as our go gauge, and it should close on it, and it does. And it doesn't eject as we kind of expected. We've got an issue there with the extractor hook being too long. Okay, so now what I've done is, if you watched some of our other videos, talk about using our brass as headspace gauges and then trying to figure out how much headspace there is. So this one has 2 layers of cellophane tape on it. Cellophane tape's about 2 thousandths each. So we've got about 4 thousandths here. And remember I said that a no-go gauge is typically about 5 thousandths for semi-spec on 4440. So we would expect it to close on a 4 thousandths, and it does. And it was a little bit tight, so I don't think it's much beyond 4 thousandths. So now we've got a 6 thousandths headspace gauge here, homemade headspace gauge, and that's the best kind because it's the brass we're going to use and the rim thickness we're going to use. And here we go. Now that field gauge was 7 thousandths, so we know it wouldn't close on that, and we would expect that it won't close on 6 thousandths either. And there we are. It's a little bit higher than that 7 thousandths no-go gauge, or field gauge, excuse me. But so this thing's at about 5 thousandths, which would be, if we cut a brand new chamber, be right in there about what we would be shooting for. So let's go buy that lottery ticket. We got this original chamber that was cut in 1885, and we didn't even have to touch it. And you can't see from the outside that barrel's ever been set back. And now we've got a gun that should be functional and perfectly capable of shooting with it without backing primers out or having case head separations or any of that kind of stuff. Let's go see. Okay, so now it's time to see if what was essentially a wall hanger is now a shooter. Now this thing doesn't have a great bore, so we've got some 4440 that I loaded up with a 431 diameter bullet. This is a really light smokeless load of 2400, and it's going to make less pressure than black powder loads. So for those of you who really cringe about black powder or smokeless powder loads in black powder era rifles, this is actually a less pressure than those black powder loads, and actually going to be a little easier on the rifle. Okay. And here we go. We're shooting at about 50 yards. Of course, I had the sights off when I had it in the lathe, and I've just kind of eyeballed it in, so we're going to see just how this thing is, how the sights are. I'm really kind of hustling here because it looks like there's some snow maybe coming over the rim, so we need to get our test firing in before the snow hits. Oh, so far so good. Okay, so it did eject, and I wasn't expecting that because on the bench down at the shop it didn't eject. Okay, let's go again. Hey, there we go. It's kind of weak, but it's working. Okay, I'm going to just shoot 3 and then we'll go down and see if it's grouping up at all. Okay, let's see how we did. And one thing for sure, those primers are not backing out a bit. Okay, not a group to write home about by any means at 50 yards. We got one here, and one here. You know, it's making round holes, so it's not keyholing. They are stabilized, but you know, this is one that probably take a little load development. And if it really was trying to shoot real accurately, we'd probably have to reline that bore. But you know, it's certainly gone from a wall hanger to a shootable firearm and usable now. All right, now my favorite part of any shooting scene, the offhand milk jug targets. Now, admittedly, this one's not grouped up really great. We're just going to leave the sights where they are and hope for the best. If we can hit 50% on this, I'd be happy. Let's see how it goes. We've got a couple of them up here, a little beyond 50 yards, and then one up on the hill there, probably 80 to 100 yards. Oh, right at the base of it. Let's see, come up just a hair. That hit it. Oh, I'm sure it hit it, but I don't see the fluid coming out. Let's try the other one. Maybe it'll be a little easier. Oh, right over the top. I'm loving that these are ejecting. That's great. There, that drilled it. Oh, okay, let's see what we can do with this one way up the hill there. That hit it. I heard it hit. Yeah, and I see some fluid coming out of it. So, you know, it's not just a tack driver just yet, and some of that's because I'm cold out here and kind of shivering, but you know, this is fantastic. This is a gun with 60 thousandths headspace, you know, and there's a certain group of people out there, and it drives me a little crazy at times, that think that any defect or ill treatment these guns have gotten over their lifetime is just part of the history of the gun and they should be left alone. I don't subscribe to that, and particularly in a case like this, where we take a gun that's basically unusable and make it a shooter again. I mean, I don't think there's just no question in my mind that that's the right thing to do. Well, this particular Colt Burgess rifle was sent out for this barrel setback by my good friend Sam Simmons back in Pocahontas, Arkansas. Now, Sam is just a godsend for those of us who work on these old obsolete firearms. See, he's about the only guy out there who makes the parts for a lot of these old guns. You know, and the Colt Burgess is no different. He makes just about all the internal parts for these Colt Burgess rifles, and nobody else does. And there's a whole bunch of other models that he's the only guy, and he sells on Gunbroker and on eBay. But I'll leave his contact information in the description, and if you have something that you need for one of these old obsolete rifles, it might not be listed on his listings, you know, get a hold of him and he may have it in stock. It's happened several times for me, and it saves him having to pay the commission to those websites as well. So, Sam, thanks a bunch for all you've done for us, and I'm pretty sure you and the fellow you sent this for is going to be plumb happy. Well, thanks for joining us today. I hope you folks really enjoyed this episode. I know I have. Until next time, happy trails from the Cinnabar.